Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for everybody to enter the room here, and then we'll get started. So yes, feel free to use your videos. It's always nice to see who I'm connecting with. I know some of you. Hi, Bernardina. Am I saying that right? Bernardina?
Bev.
Sorry, can you say it again?
Yeah, you know me by Bev.
Beth. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Bruce. Where are you from?
Hey, Catherine from Calgary.
Oh, okay. Which organization are you with?
I run my own company. It's called JBCC Consulting, but I do a lot of work through a company called GCLSE, or Global Center for Safety and Leadership
Oh,
Excellence.
interesting. Great. Awesome. We've got Catherine from Easter Seals and Tracy. Hi, Tracy. Tracy, can you hear me?
Look like it.
I'm not sure if you can or not. Tracy Johnson? Is that the right name on yours? I wonder if it's not the right name that's showing up.
Oh, sorry. No, it's not. I was obviously logged in as someone else and not connecting.
I figured because I could see you weren't muted, but we see that a lot. So hi, welcome.
Hello, my name's Rachel. I'm with
Hi,
the
Rachel.
Calgary Public Library Foundation.
Sorry, which foundation?
The Calgary Public Library Foundation.
Oh, nice. I love the Calgary Public Library. So we're just letting everybody in the room here. I know we've got quite a few people signed up. So welcome. We'll get started in a few minutes. Hi, Gail. Oh, she's still connecting. Hi, Ida. Hi, Meg.
You do a lot of Zoom stuff, Catherine?
We do. Yeah. All of a sudden, though, everything's back in person. Have you found that?
It's definitely going that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking to one person and said maybe we should just like, I'm fairly close to downtown. I said maybe we should just meet up for a cup of coffee instead of doing this. Because I always cloud group or something like that, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting how our lives are starting to change again. So
totally. I have forgotten about travel time and how much time it takes.
Yes, there's a little bit of discussion about that too. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not used to traffic anymore.
A lot of people aren't too positive about that aspect of it. So
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Gail. Nice to see you. I'm not sure if she can hear me yet. Okay, so we're at 10 a.m. So I know we're going to have a bunch more people joining, and I am recording the session. So for people who can't make it, we always encourage them to sign up, and then we always send the recording out. I'm going to ask you to mute because we are getting a bit of background noise from someone. So if everybody could mute, that would be great. And I think I can do it for everyone, but I don't, let me just see here. There, I think I got it. Okay. Oh, okay, great. Lots of people from Kids Cancer Care. We love Kids Cancer Care around here. I'm just there. We've got a lot more people joining all of a sudden. That's great. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to be letting people into the room as I see them pop up. Today, we're going to be talking about facing cancel culture, which is a very big topic for a lot of people. And I think a really important conversation for us to be having. If any of you know me, I'm pretty laid back. So I really like interruptions. I like people unmuting, asking questions. I think that makes for a better presentation. So please don't be shy about doing that. Like I said, I think it makes for a much better presentation. I'm going to be showing some videos. I'm going to be showing a lot of different slides and talking about a lot of different audiences that we speak to. So I'm not sure if I've introduced myself yet. I'm Catherine Kolacek. I own Alchemy Communications. So we specialize in marketing and public relations, but we also do a lot of crisis communications and more lately, for sure. So, and we're seeing that come up in so many different ways and formats, and conflicts and issues are coming up in ways that we didn't expect and didn't see a couple of years ago prior to COVID. We spend a lot of time with our nonprofit clients. So 50% of our business is nonprofit and municipal work. So our municipalities are facing very different conversations than our nonprofit clients. And then our other side of our business is small to mid-sized businesses. So right now we have a lot of software companies and some oil and gas and some specialty consulting companies, HR, that kind of thing. So lots of different conversations that we're having. And like I said, today, our audience is very diverse as well. So feel free to jump in with any kind of conflicts that you're having, and we can always discuss it. So I want to start talking about cancel culture. So when I talk about cancel culture today, we're really talking about the popular practice of withdrawing support, canceling someone or a company after they've done something or said something that has been considered objectionable or offensive. So, you know, we've seen a lot of this, and we've seen a lot of people flip-flop between being canceled, coming back. You know, we just saw the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial happening that was so complicated in terms of language and who's right, who's wrong, and you know, how public figures represent topics like domestic violence and addiction issues, and so very complicated conversations. So we've seen Johnny Depp be canceled, then we saw him kind of resume some popularity over social media. We saw Amber Heard being canceled after kind of representing domestic violence. It's been very complicated, and there's many different examples of this. But when I talk about it, we're really talking about the digital sphere, and nobody is immune to this. So even if you think that you're not spending a lot of time on social media, that just means that you're not participating in the conversation. So you're not immune to it if you're just not on social media, that's for sure. It used to be people would say, well, I don't use social media, or I stay away from it. So I'm not really open to that, but you are. So you just, if you're not watching it, you're just not a part of the conversation. So we really see cancel culture tracing its roots back to the Me Too movement, and which I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with, but in case you're not, the Me Too movement was about bringing accountability to powerful people that had previously been immune to any kind of consequences. And we saw this in terms of sexual violence against women and sexual inappropriateness or sexual harassment, those kinds of things. So when we think about someone like Harvey Weinstein, who is this kind of despicable personality, but extremely successful and extremely wealthy, you can see how he had been immune to any kind of consequence for his behavior. And so the Me Too movement was about making those previously immune people, holding them accountable, and stepping away from the prior formats of due diligence. And so there was pros and cons to that, as we all, I'm sure, remember from that Me Too conversation. So the pandemic has only increased the cultural impact and the power of the internet because we are all spending so much time. Bruce and I were just talking about this. You know, we're having conversations now. Are we going to have a conversation over Zoom? Or are we actually going to meet in person? And I think all of us have a new respect for how much time we've spent on the internet, and kind of probably a new horror for taking a look at how many hours we're on the internet. So when we were cut off from that social and physical world, we've been spending record amounts of time. And all of anybody who I have an iPhone, and so I get that weekly report of how much time you're on your phone. You're like, whoa, I need to have a hobby. So, and then of course, the murder of George Floyd was a moment that really catalyzed this search for justice. In the United States is where it started, of course. And so the Black Lives Matter really took off and really led this movement forward of holding people accountable that were previously immune. So I want to just show you from a Google search that we did a little while ago. But this is where we searched for how often the term of cancel culture was searched. And so you can see it was really minimal in September of 2018 to July 1st of 2020. And this is as the Black Lives Matter movement was really taking off. So we're really seeing this language of cancel culture when we previously hadn't. We'd seen people, certainly, like the angry mob has always been around as long as humans have been around. This is just the digital form of that. So of course, there's a good way to do this and a bad way of doing this. We like to talk a lot about calling in our colleagues and our friends and our family around their behavior versus calling someone out and publicly shaming them. So, you know, you can always call in a colleague and say, you know, I just want to talk to you a little bit about how that comment landed. And, you know, it's holding people accountable in a sensitive way, privately. You know, a lot of times people have good intentions, but their impact can be harmful. And so we're always talking about impact versus your intention. It doesn't matter if your intention was good. If your impact is harmful, there's damage that's done. So you have to be really cautious about that. And then we move into a mass group of people holding an organization or a person accountable, and then the public shaming, and then the total boycotting. But where I see a lot of this problem happening is the public shaming of an opinion. I was at a conference on the weekend, and for municipal elected officials in the municipalities across the country. And I was talking to one municipal official who was Indigenous and was raised in a residential school and had an actual positive experience, which is of course in the minority. And when they spoke about the experience that they had being positive, their community was upset because they felt like she wasn't being supportive, or maybe diminishing or dismissing the trauma that had been inflicted in terms of those crimes against humanity that we see in other residential schools. And so, you know, here's a person that is Indigenous themselves, had grown up in the residential system. That's not right. We know it's not right, but didn't have the same kind of experience that others had. And so it's a very complicated conversation. And now it's getting to the point where people are scared to say anything for fear of being publicly canceled or called out. And that one is you can see the pain in this person's eyes because, you know, their community is so important to them, and they were trying to talk about their personal experience, but it didn't match or reflect what their peers in the country had experienced. And also it didn't match a conversation that was happening that was looking for accountability. And so it was problematic for sure. And that continues to evolve. So when we talk about what calls for cancellations, we're talking about language or actions that are unacceptable, they're problematic, offensive. Sometimes they're straight up illegal. So Harvey Weinstein, totally illegal, his behavior. He deserves to be in prison as far as I can tell. Courts have decided that in the United States. Bill Cosby is another one. we're seeing some a Canadian fashion designer right now in the media for his behavior. Those people, it sounds like in that case, it hasn't been decided, but it sounds like it is criminal behavior. And those people deserve to be canceled. I'm not sure that you should be able to recover when you've done horrific things. And then we move into like bigoted, sexist, racist behavior. Also, I can see that is worth, it could be worth cancellation if you're not willing to change as a result of that. So when we look at someone like Roseanne Barr, who made racist comments, there's a number of celebrities that we could lean on that have made racist comments and weren't willing to change when they were told of the impact of their language and the harm that it caused. And so they've definitely not recovered from that. And I'm not sure that they should. I'm not sure I'm the person to decide that either. And then we see someone like J.K. Rowling, who, and in Canada, I know we've got some international folks joining, but in Canada, we see some, one of my favorite writers, Margaret Atwood, who's, been very influential in the feminist movement in Canada. And J.K. Rowling, has, they've both said some comments that around trans women and on different varying levels. And I understand where they're trying to come from that feminist perspective, but the language can cause harm when you don't understand the, I would say, trauma that it takes a trans person to grow up in a world where they're not accepted. So when we look at language and we look at conversations, we have to look at the impact of those conversations on the people that are harmed as a result. And so it becomes quite complicated. And it becomes quite complicated to have a conversation when you're trying to not cause harm too. So you can see from a communications perspective, teasing these conversations out, teasing this language out
is actually very difficult.
It's so difficult. It's so difficult. And myself, I do this work all the time. I'm constantly having these conversations. I've presented this exact presentation many times, and I still make mistakes. So we have a colleague that we work very closely with. I'll just be getting some background noise, so I'm just going to get everybody to mute if you haven't already. But we have a colleague we work very closely with in the UK who does a lot of work around rape culture on campuses in the UK. And they use that language, that hashtag rape culture. But when I did a presentation for UBC, I was pulled aside, called in, and very appropriately, very professional way to say, we don't use the word rape at UBC. We use sexual violence against women because it encompasses more, and that was their decision. So even myself, who I'm doing these conversations all the time, regionally, the language is very different. In Alberta, we use the language of, when we talk about people of color and addressing women or people who have been impacted as a result of being a person of color, we use sometimes an acronym called BIPOC, and I use that language in Oregon, and it wasn't accepted. They prefer to ask people what their background is and to address that background, or not address it at all. And so it becomes quite complicated when you're having conversations like this. So I try to say in all my presentations, I'm doing the best I can, but please let me know if I'm doing something that you might find offensive, or if I have learning to do. And then I'm open to hearing it. And I think that is the action that can help move us through these conversations, but I'm still learning as well. So when we're talking about the people that definitely deserve to be canceled, it's usually people that have they're refusing to take any accountability for their wrongdoings, or sometimes I don't want to say wrongdoings. Bill Cosby, wrongdoing. Roseanne Barr wrongdoing, other people that maybe, and J.K. Rowling, I'm not a trans person, so I have a hard time addressing the impact. But when I talk to trans people that are colleagues of mine, there was harm caused by that. And so I think that that needs to be addressed by that person. And we need to have more education to support that community as they, as that community becomes a more accepted part of our community. So anyway, as you can see, it's complicated. So the challenge is definitely this criteria as a moving target. As you can see, it changes, I feel like, on a day-to-day basis. I do my best. We talk about it all the time in our office, and we talk about impact again. Like it doesn't matter what my intention is. My intention is that everybody feels welcome and in the work that I do. But sometimes there's going to be impacts that weren't intentional, and I need to address them and take accountability for it. So, and our clients do as well. So we do a lot of work around how to take accountability. But what is the exact definition of unacceptable, problematic, offensive? When you're representing an organization, what is your organization's exact definition? That's very complicated. If you're an elected official, what is your constituents' exact definition of unacceptable, problematic, or offensive behavior? That is very hard to nail down. And we're seeing that across the country on different topics. We do a lot of flood mitigation work, for example, in one region where climate change is not readily acceptable. So if the constituents of the elected officials are not believing in climate change, and yet a risk is there for a public disaster because of climate change, that's a very complicated conversation. So you can see how nuanced this becomes. And the internet for sure is not always good at detecting nuance. Anybody who's in a romantic relationship and tries to have a conflict conversation over text knows this very well. There is a wide spectrum of opinions and values and ideologies, and thank goodness there is. That's what makes being human so interesting. And we have to be willing to have conversations and listen in order to move through those. But context absolutely matters. There is no cookie cutter solution to this. And I wish I could say in the hour that we're going to be together, here's the solution. I don't have it. I wish I did, but it doesn't work that way. And we're going to have to work through moving targets as we have these conversations. And also, I think we need to protect ourselves from them. So organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, municipalities, anyone in an elected official type of role, anyone representing a business, you are held to a higher standard. So anyone serving important community needs, nonprofits especially, are very often tasked with being leaders when it comes to social progress, which isn't really fair when they don't have the budgets to do this. But we have to really look at that, and we have to look at, our elected officials, our nonprofits, our small businesses. Everybody's over capacity right now. It's not just nonprofits. It's not just municipalities. We've all come out of a pandemic. I think it's fair to say everybody is navigating a new world right now. It's a time of transition. And so finding time and resources for things like policy development, professional training, structural overhaul is very challenging for everyone right now. And then when we look at nonprofits, a lot of nonprofits are still, we're still operating. And when I talk about colonialism, I'm talking about Canada in this moment. Obviously, where the Queen just celebrated her platinum jubilee. We are operating within a colonial structure, a colonial system. When you register a nonprofit business, when you use Canadian law, those are colonial structures, and that's not really debated. But if you're also trying to support Indigenous communities and the truth and reconciliation that goes along with representing that community and embracing that passed, it's very difficult to change that system while working within it. Nonprofits and municipalities are depending on constituents, donors, sponsors to survive. Clients, we have very set standards of values that we work with and who we work with as clients. So we represent a number of different organizations that represent the queer community. And then we're also asked to represent faith-based organizations as well. And so our faith-based organizations have to meet our same values around inclusivity and welcoming to the queer community, for example, or diversity in other client relationships. And so we have had to say no to certain organizations. So it's difficult to make truly independent decisions when all of these things come into play. So you can see how nuanced it becomes and how complicated.
Catherine, I have a question for you.
Yes, go ahead.
So I find cancel culture really interesting, and I found in recent years some actually queer left-wing writers who are incredibly critical of it and talk about it as being opposed to those kind of socialist values that they're supposed to represent, etc. And I'm curious, because you work with such a variety of different organizations, if you've seen any organizations take a PR strategy where they actually stand against cancel culture from like a value basis of like inclusivity or anything like that. Because I'm wondering if that will be a pushback we'll see in coming years of just because like everything you outlined, like how nuanced it is. And it's like, well, if it's appropriate or not, but according to who and whose standards, and there appears to be a mob out there who has all the answers, but there's no body or organization, or it's kind of up to the whims of, there's no static, this is what's appropriate and this is what's not. It's ever evolving and ever changing. So I'm curious if I think we might be at a place where we might start to see a pushback against cancel culture at all. And if you started to see any organizations deal with it strategically, not maybe so much from the, anger that it exists, but actually kind of leaning into it and go, this is against our values, we don't support it, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, none of our clients are currently taking that path, mostly because they all have strategic objectives that don't fall into how social culture is communicating around topics like this. So usually, for example, when we represented Pride in different areas, they have a very strategic path. So their strategic goals were around inclusivity, not necessarily around the conversation of cancel culture. Now, if you look at Pride organizations, they have really struggled with cancel culture, interestingly enough. On one hand, they're, talking about inclusivity, and on another, there's criticism. Nobody, like I said, nobody is immune, right? There is criticism around how those organizations have addressed all of the different groups that fall within the acronyms. So, whether you use LGBTQ or 2S plus or whatever format. And I would encourage you to look into the history of the format of those letters. Is fascinating. But Indigenous communities that have always embraced the two-spirited folks, there's been some criticism of Pride that they haven't, of different regional prides, that they haven't really included them. So to your question of, are we being asked to address cancel culture as a topic? No, we're not. We're mostly asked to address a client that's been canceled as a result of something. That being said, we're seeing a lot of individuals come out and criticize cancel culture, celebrities. For example, Ricky Gervais is very critical. Even the fellow, I can't think of his name right now, but he plays Mr. Bean. He's very critical of cancel culture. There's lots of people that are coming out and saying, this isn't how we should be having discussions. Comedians are very heavily leaning into this right now because they've been held accountable for a lot of things that they've said. Now, do I this is something that I find even challenging. The Me Too movement, I think, had benefits. It had consequences as well. There's nothing is perfect, but it's Rowan Atkinson. Thank you so much, is Mr. Bean. The murder of George Floyd catalyzing people to say, we have got to do something. Not just in the United States, but in Canada too, we really saw a response to that. Like this kind of behavior can no longer continue, and we have to address it. And so, I'm as much as I've seen the damages of cancel culture, I've seen some positives. So it's very challenging to kind of put your finger on whether it's good or bad. And I think that's the nuance, right? But great question. And so I wish we had a client, because I would love to dig into that, but it would be a challenge, that's for sure. We do, in our office, we talk about calling in how challenging that is. And where we see it, it's not our colleagues that we see it, it's our families most of the time. It's Thanksgiving dinner where grandma says something and you go, what did you just say? Right? And we know like that's not the way. We don't publicly shame someone, but someone who's had a different lived experience than us has a different, and what used to be culturally acceptable is not, as we know. So really interesting question. Thank you. Edelman, go ahead.
Sorry, if you do end up with a client that does that, I'll want to follow their social media pages.
Okay, I will let you know. Let you know. Edelman is a really interesting PR company, international, and they do a trust barometer. So they do it every year. I encourage you to look at it. It was fascinating this year and last year as well, because they started to show that people were trusting their employers more than they trusted NGOs or their elected officials, which is a totally new place for us to be. So organizations really need to pay attention, because if you're not leading a social or political issue and participating in it in an effective way, then your employees and your clients and your stakeholders are not going to be as supportive as they had been in the past. So the public is demanding that organizations address their history and shortcomings, commit to change. And this is very challenging for a lot of organizations to do, especially, I just mentioned the Platinum Jubilee of the Queen. In preparation for this Jubilee, a number of the working royals had traveled to different countries. Some of the most popular ones had been in the Caribbean, where they were, people were holding them accountable. Prince Charles was just in Canada, and people were saying, like, how are you being held accountable for the colonialism and the damage that caused? So you can see the monarchy, they don't even know how to address it, let alone the Canadian government and other governments around the world. Silence says we don't care. So it is not a strategy. So when we have a client come to us and they're being dragged into a conversation, they often will say, what if we just don't say anything? What if we just put our head in the sand? You can't do that anymore. Unfortunately, you're going to have to say something, because if you say nothing, you're saying to the most important people in your world that this issue that's so important to them means nothing to you. So that is not a strategy that you can really lean into. But also, I want to encourage you to not make an empty statement of solidarity, because if you do that, you're going to be held accountable. So if you say, we stand behind land recognitions, and you don't actually do anything that supports the Indigenous communities, you're going to be held accountable to that. You can't make those empty statements, that virtue signaling that we've seen so many times it's not appropriate. And you can almost face even more consequences by saying something that you actually don't believe in. So now woke washing, so pretending that you're woke. I'm too old to even say that word. A colleague of mine that helped me do all the research for this presentation wrote this, and I laughed when I saw it, because I thought, I'm 44. I can't say I'm woke, but that woke washing doesn't cut it at all. So when you adopt progressive values or running a purpose-driven campaign without taking any real action, you absolutely threaten your credibility. You threaten the trust of your stakeholders, your employees, your partners. It absolutely causes reputational damage. We see a lot of damage in this sector or in this issue particularly. It can result in being called out publicly again. So the public shaming is what we're looking at here, and then a cancellation. And what we find in terms of cancellations is people calling on that person to resign. That's typically the first call to action that we see in one of these conversations online. Everybody gets very upset, and then they'll call on that leader to resign. Typically we'll call on board members to resign. They're looking for action, a workplace investigation, a resignation, termination, those kinds of things. And anybody who's an employer knows, it's not always that easy to do that. Investigations nowadays, especially ones that are more complex around accusations of racism or systemic racism or gender based violence or sexual harassment. Those are very complicated workplace investigations that are very expensive. So not all businesses can afford that. Certainly nonprofits struggle with this. Small businesses very, very much so are struggling with this. So you have to be cautious. Going back to that woke washing conversation, the woke washing is the appropriation of ethical and progressive values as a form of advertising. So we really saw this when it came to the pride organizations that we worked with. It's called pink washing when it speaks to the queer community. So pink washing, jumping on the pride bandwagon in order to advertise your business really diminishes the importance of the Pride March and where the historical foundations of Pride came from. It's not actually taking, when people are doing that for advertising, they're actually not marching with the community as allies. They're looking to build their business. And so pink washing is really looked harshly upon. And most Pride organizations, when you look at sponsorship, you have to really typically will have to meet a number of different objectives to prove that you are actually an organization that is a safe place for the queer community and is doing more than just looking for an advertising opportunity. Greenwashing is the same. We see this all the time. So marketing efforts pretending to be environmentally friendly, but actually not working to reduce environmental impact. If you're found out on any of these things, and sometimes, we see certainly people lying about this, and then we also see people inadvertently thinking they're doing the right thing, and then finding out after that it wasn't the process that they believed it to be. You're still called out for that. You can still be canceled for that. Lots of examples of this in the news that on a regular basis that you can take a look at. So woke washers be warned. And even companies like Pepsi, who have nothing but resources to invest in this kind of advertising and this kind of sponsorship and getting behind issues, have been held to account. So this is prior to, I think everybody remembers this. This is prior to COVID, so it feels like a time warp. But this conversation, I'll pull up the actual video at the end if we have time. But this advertising came out. It was a Kardashian here who's used in order to stop a protest by drinking Pepsi. She comes out, she takes a wig off, she hands it to a person of color, and she cracks open a Pepsi, and everybody is peaceful and lives happily ever after. And it was just seen as such a missed a misstep for sure, if not even worse. And I'm always happy to share my slides if we don't have time to show this, but I would encourage you to look at the responses that are in the video that came through social media. And then also the past missteps that Pepsi had made. They pulled up old advertisements where they had made terrible mistakes. And so nothing is forgotten, and anything that lives on the internet lives into perpetuity. So people don't forget. So you can't make mistakes like this. So even organizations that have a tremendous amount of resources, when you're talking to different communities, you better have those communities in the room evaluating your work in order to make a decision on marketing. So that community consultation, that nothing for us without us, is so important to acknowledge. This is in my local community. So we have an ice cream company. It used to be, it was a different name. It was very well respected, and they rebranded as Righteous. And their whole concept was to give money back to the community from profits. And so, on the outset, it looked like a really good campaign. Very popular, again, a very popular brand in my city. And then George Floyd was murdered. It was in the start of the pandemic. So they came out with this product very quickly. They used a local artist that was not a person of color. The ownership of this company was all Caucasian. They put Black Lives Matter, which is an organizational name, on their product. They put the words of a man that had been murdered onto masks, as you can see. And then the profits from this product never actually went to anybody in the Black Lives Matter movement. There was so many missteps on this. This company continues to reel as a result of this. This went so active on social media in my community. Their intentions, again, I want to say, in my most generous moments, I think their intentions were good. They just made some very serious mistakes. Hindsight's always 2020. But this felt like it was leveraging the murder of somebody, leveraging the pandemic. You can imagine if this was your family member that had been murdered and his words are on an ice cream product, how awful that would feel. And then, of course, none of the money going to Black Lives Matter. It did go to other nonprofits, but not Black Lives Matter. So we all make mistakes, but you need to have community consultation in the room before you're making any decisions on these topics as a corporation. So has cancel culture gone too far, or does it work in holding people accountable? And that depends. So supporters argue that cancel culture is an important tool in holding people accountable, achieving social justice, giving a voice to those who've been historically shut out. Critics argue that the movement limits open debate, free exchange of ideas without any due process, and that the backlash, friction, and ensuing culture wars can actually be bad for solidarity and progress. So it's a very personal decision on where you feel on this cancel culture topic. I also feel like it changes topic to topic, and you have to have a critical eye in how you watch the news and how you look at cancel culture as it's happening. I feel a little sick to my stomach when I see Johnny Depp winning that trial, where a lot of other people feel like he was misjudged and maybe branded a wife beater. But when you look at some of the horrible, misogynistic, violent things he said, you can see that there was a problem there. And now he's kind of a hero after that happened. And I don't know that I couldn't watch that trial. It was too disgusting from my perspective. And we don't want to also be using celebrities that haven't chosen to represent a certain topic as our guiding influences. So cancel culture is a very complex thing. I think it's topic to topic, and I think we could debate it for hours. The emotional impact is really hard. So again, we're called in when a client has been called out. Typically it's an organization, a board, an individual. The staff supporting that person really struggle with this. So this is not a one person, one and done issue. One person may have made the misstep. Again, I'm giving a lot of credit here. Like typically it's a misstep. Their intentions were good. But the staff around this really takes a terrible toll. It is not over quickly. Sometimes it's over in days. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it goes on for months and months. We see people strategically placing themselves in this area where they feel like they need to hold others accountable. And so they will continue like a dog with a bone. They will bring up this topic over and over and over again. And it could be years later and they're still bringing it up. So this is a really important conversation to have internally, how you prevent these missteps. If it does happen, you need to be honest and transparent with your staff, your board, your stakeholders about what's going on. Everybody needs to be taking breaks from social media because it's awful. It can be traumatizing, I would say. We see people leaving positions because the stress is too much. We see relationships irreparably damaged. We like to say, remember, it's just the internet, keep things into perspective. But when you're being called horrible names, when your organization's being called horrible names, it takes its toll. Even my team who steps in on these conversations to give our clients some breathing room around it, and we're very strategic. We know what we're going to say. We see it all the time. We have to take breaks from it because it's very difficult to be called horrible names, to be threatened with violence, to have these topics go on and not, it doesn't let up sometimes for months and months and months, if not longer. So you can't leave people hanging. You have to have an action plan. You have to commit to it. We talk a lot and we offer lots of different workshops on crisis communications planning. You should have a plan in place for these kinds of events. So I would encourage you to have all kinds of different communication strategies in place. You typically would take your top 10 high risk scenarios and build out a bit of a structure around how you would handle that. Just like an operational plan, you should have a communications plan. It never happens at a convenient time. It's never Monday morning when everybody's rested. It's never convenient. For me, for some reason, Thanksgiving is always the time where it comes out. I haven't had a Thanksgiving and I don't know how long where I wasn't called into something. So you have to be prepared. If something like this was to arrive on social media at 10 o'clock on Thanksgiving evening, who's watching it? What's your response plan? What are your stakeholders? Who do you call first? Those kinds of things. I can't tell you how many times we're stuck in limbo trying to respond to something, but we don't have the proper approvals because people are on holidays. So you have to be thinking about all of those things. Reputational damage can be irreparable. So you have to be very cautious. That's why we have all of our clients doing this work in advance, because no one is immune. It happens at the most inconvenient times, and it is remarkably stressful. So don't think that you're going to be thinking straight if you're called out. And then we do a lot of work around apologies or taking accountability for impact. And we try to reframe the conversation around an operation or an opportunity for growth. But it's challenging. It's not a one and done kind of situation. It happens. It has to happen over and over again. So being accountable means you have to separate your intent from your impact. You're going to want to be defensive if you're the person being called out and say, well, that wasn't my intention. But really what you have to be talking about is, I'm so sorry that the impact was harm here. That wasn't my intention. And the structure of that messaging is really important. You focusing on the impact, not not defensiveness. So you really want to move into listening, not the defending piece. It's not about you in that situation, and that's challenging when you're the person being called out. It has to be an opportunity for growth. This is very challenging. I can't stress this enough. When I'm called out, even when it's done in a very sensitive way, you have to be cautious about that. So you have to understand why you're sorry and apologize. And you can't just issue that apology without understanding the impact. Lululemon, for example, is a really great, you would think it was a lesser controversy, but it ended up being even more damaging. So for our international folks that have joined Lululemon, that doesn't know Lululemon, it's a Canadian company, athletic wear, really focused on the yoga products for women. So stretchy pants, for example. And what women were finding and complaining about online is that the product was see-through. Most companies that have a product defect would apologize, offer discounts, offer refunds, potentially fix it, move forward. Lululemon had their CEO go onto different media outlets and lean into, that some women shouldn't be wearing these kinds of pants, that their thighs rubbing creates the defect, and was even more offensive than that. So I don't know if anybody remembers this, but he really leaned into, kind of fat shaming a lot of women out there. And it created this huge uproar. He then a week later tried to fix it by apologizing on a video that was shared widely over social media, but really apologized to his staff and asked them to stay out of the conversation. So it was one misstep after the other, eventually lost his role as CEO of the company, and is kind of known as a bit of a despicable person now as a result of this. This was something that could have been so easily nipped in the bud, but it's a person not understanding what the impact was, how offensive it was, before issuing an apology. So you have to really identify action for growth and meaningful change in order to really recover effectively from these situations and these missteps that we all make. Like I said, nobody's immune. We're all making mistakes and we're all learning from them. So we really encourage our clients to take action now to avoid a crisis later. So identify your risks, invest in policies, recruitment, training, partnerships, learn from the communities that you're serving or that you're trying to speak to, center them in the decision-making process. Again, nothing for us without us is such an important model for how we make these decisions. Get inspired, find out what your community cares about, and get to work at making a difference if that's what you're leaning into. So we really chose actively as a group on my team what we were going to be passionate about and what we were passionate about as a team. And that was really the Indigenous communities in Canada and certain actions on the Truth and Reconciliation report. So that was what was important to us. That's what we did. And a number of actions were made as a result of that from our team's perspective. And my team holds me to that. And sometimes it's not easy. I have to, I'm a small business. I know other businesses have struggled during the pandemic. We were lucky enough in order to meet all of those objectives, but some days it was hard to make those financial decisions and investments. But you're certainly not going to be talking about it if you're stepping away from it. If not, you're going to be held accountable to it. And then communicate. How are you keeping your community informed and engaged in this process as you move through it? And that sometimes takes a lot of bravery because we're having to talk about the missteps that we make and the mistakes that we make. So the way forward is really being clear on your values. We all have those value statements, and I would encourage you to look at them regularly, test your messaging against them. kind of roll our eyes sometimes at these value statements, because people write them and then they never look at them again, and they never hold themselves to them when they're making decisions around the progress of the company. And when we come in, especially in these kinds of situations, it's one of the first questions we ask, because our messaging structure is going to lean on those values, and our recommendations for how you move forward are going to be based in those values. So I would encourage you to look at them and recommit to them if they've been outdated. Be authentic. So you have to create a rock solid strategic alignment between your core mission, the values of your community, what you're doing, how you're doing it. And then take some measured risk. If you do decide to take a stand on something, you can't change your mind or become wishy-washy halfway through. You do have to take some risk in doing this. And we see that typically really pay off from a PR perspective. And hopefully that's not the only reason you're doing it, but it does in the end work from a business perspective. But you have to walk your talk, take that stand, support your words with your actions, and do it continuously over time. It's not, like I said, this is never going to be a one and done thing. You don't get to make a one-time $100 donation to Pride and then call yourself an ally if you're not actually living those values in terms of allyship in your organization. And know that you're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. This is where we have to really step away from that finger pointing, that public shaming when we do make a mistake, because nobody is immune. You always hope for the best, but you have to plan for something to happen. And so can your organization withstand a controversy? Have you built up enough positive sentiment in your community to own it and to recover from it? And that takes time as well. It takes investment. And then have a crisis comms plan. You can't afford to be unprepared. Your crisis communication strategy, just like your operational plan, needs to be constantly adapted to a shifting social environment. So what you wrote in 2020 prior to the pandemic, if you wrote it in January of 2020, you probably will need to change it. So you need to be constantly updating things as our social environment changes. So that brings me to the end of my slide deck. I want to open the panel to anybody who has a question. I'm happy to do that. I am always happy if anybody wants to speak about this privately. Sometimes we've made mistakes and we don't want to talk about it in front of colleagues that we don't necessarily know. So my contact information is here. If you want the slides, I'm happy to show that slide deck. I do realize we're coming to the end of the hour, so I'm happy to stick around for a few extra minutes too, if anybody has to go. But thank you all for attending. Are there any questions I can address? I know I've covered a lot of information really quickly.
Catherine, quite often, it's Bruce here.
Hi.
You see the polarization that seems to go on between the different views. And
Yes.
I was wondering any thoughts on how do you close that a little bit? Because I think that's incredibly difficult to do, if at all, sometimes.
I totally agree with you. It is very difficult. We're living in such a different time. And I think, again, this is that shifting social environment. I feel like 10 years ago, we didn't have that same polarized environment. 5 years ago, I don't even think it was as bad as it is right now. My brother said to me the other day, he said, when did being a conservative turn into such a bad word? And so your question though is how do we move through that? What I like to do is to ask questions and to lean into curiosity, even though I'm pretty outspoken on my own views. I try to take a step back, especially on certain things. So, for example, when I was talking about that community that, has quite a few people that don't believe in climate change, I like to sit down and ask them about their experiences in the community. And a lot of times they're telling me, I've lived in this community and it's a heavily populated seniors area, like quite a few seniors in the area. One fellow said to me, I've lived here since 1946 and I've never seen a flood. And so he talked about that for a long time. And And so you can see how that could be a challenging conversation for him. And you can see how it would be challenging to hear why this was so important when there was significant financial impacts to him. And at the end of the day, we're not going to change his mind. I'm not going to make him a believer in climate change, but I can listen to his perspective and I can feel for him, because this isn't just him digging his heels in for the sake of digging his heels in. There's consequences that have major impacts to him financially, from the value of his home, for what his quality of living looks like where he lives going forward. So we have to be willing to hear and listen to other people's lived experiences, even if it is so divergent from our own, and sometimes quite distasteful. We do a lot of government relations work as well. And I was just working with an organization in Southern Alberta, and we were talking about working with government elected officials who have very one individual in particular who they found quite distasteful. And it doesn't matter. It's not about you. It's about moving forward on an objective sometimes, especially with government relations, and working with them in order to achieve a goal that's, in this case, was supporting seniors in assisted living. So, and when we look at those complicated conversations like that, we typically are leaning into curiosity. And for us as a strategic communications firm, we're often writing those questions for our clients. What are the questions you can ask? What are the things that this person that they don't want to work with is passionate about? And what are some things that they can see maybe relatable that they can lean into? But Bruce, it's a very challenging thing. I typically step down in terms of the power structure of the conversation, of the dynamic, and lean into questions and less around my own strategic objective. And sometimes that's challenging, but it's always strategic. I'm thinking of my ex-husband here in this moment. I'm like, that is really challenging. Talk about polarized views. Good question though, Bruce. Any other questions? Has anybody had an experience they'd like to talk about in terms of cancel culture? This one takes some bravery, and if you don't want to, I understand. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I'll stick around if you have more questions. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This actually isn't a question. It was just a comment about one brand that I think, I mean, it's pre-pandemic now, but I thought that they did an excellent job of being proactive on these things, was National Geographic. They did, this was a few years ago now, but they did an audit on their entire catalog of magazines that they put out for their whole history, and they analyzed the impact that their stories had on people's perception of colonization, people's perceptions of Indigenous cultures in other areas, and admitted and realized that they had created issues around colonialism. They had created issues around exotification of other people and other places, and then they created a plan moving forward about how they were going to stop doing that. And we don't often hear the good stories, but I thought that was like a really excellent example of, I mean, obviously they have resources, but they put their resources into it in a way that really they walked the walk.
I hadn't heard that story before. I will look that up, because that is an awesome example of doing what's right? Recognizing where they've made a mistake historically, owning it. It takes a lot of bravery to do that, right? To own it and then to come forward with an action plan. It takes bravery, it takes time, it takes a tremendous amount of resources, but what a great example. That's a great example.
I guess a question leading off of that would be, So if you're looking, let's say like you're looking at something that is a bit historical. So for example, I'm with the YMCA. So
Yeah.
one thing we think about a lot is we have past generations of YMCA staff and future generations of YMCA staff, because we're over 100 years old and we intend to be around for a very long time.
Yes.
So how do you navigate things when, let's say, past generations of YMCA staff have made a mistake? Like, let's say,
Yes.
for example, we can look back and somebody's like, well, in the 1990s, you held this thing, but you didn't realize like your organization did a bunch of damage to this community. And we're sitting here looking at something that happened that many years ago. We probably don't have great documentation of it, you know,
Right.
that kind of a thing. This is a hypothetical, but
Right.
how would you approach something like that if you're being called out or called in, whichever it is, for something that is in your past that none of your current employees had anything to do with?
Right.
How would you tackle something like that?
Well, and that's a really interesting question. YMCA, we've worked with in a number of different regions too. And so you're in a unique position as well, because not only do you have a huge history, you have a huge geographical reach. And so what someone might have done in Minnesota is totally different than YMCA in Calgary or Vancouver or Toronto, right? It might have been very different. Scouts Canada is Scouts International is reeling from this right now on a very serious, set of crimes. And so, and every country is actually facing this, of course, right? How are we as, and I'm a Canadian, so I'm going to keep leaning on to that, but how are Canadians responsible for the residential school system, for example? And again, we have to lean into curiosity. We have to lean into the impact and harm that was caused, as opposed to our own personal accountability. It's not about us in the moment. It's about finding out where the harm was. In a perfect scenario, you would be like National Geographic. You would have all of the historical data in one archive to pull up and go, we made a big mistake here. In 1986, on June 4th, we made a terrible mistake. This was the action, and this is what we have to do to repair it. Most organizations do not have that luxury. And so what I would encourage you to do is to start leaning into the conversation around and I know that was a hypothetical for you, leaning into a conversation about what happened if you actually were facing it, what happened, conducting interviews, conducting an investigation. So an organization called L'Arche, which is international, was founded by a person that was heavily involved in the Catholic Church, has since passed away. This organization is decades old, and we were involved in the Western Canadian PR strategy around this, but internationally, an investigation was conducted. And again, this is a luxury. It doesn't happen very often, but they found that there was accusations of sexual assault against this founder. Luckily, not against the clients that they serve, which are people with disabilities, but it's still crimes against a number of women. There were sexual violence crimes. So after he died, the investigations happened. They were concluded. It was found, again, it's not criminal because the person has died, it was found to be credible. And so they had to release internationally at the same time a statement taking accountability for the actions and the harm that were caused, even though they had nothing to do with it. And so we all still have to lean into that accountability piece, even when we're not directly accountable for it. And that's a very challenging conversation to have. And we don't always have the luxury of having those archives, right, of what exactly happened. And sometimes you have to hear something from the lens of the person that experienced it. Their truth is different than the person that, the person that was right beside them. And so you have to listen with curiosity, even understanding that their lens is going to be different than someone else's, for example. And especially if they have a different background than you, that lens is going to be even more divergent. And so we have to be thinking about it from that context and sensitive to it from that context. And it takes so much education to do this. This work is never done. And I feel like we're always learning on this, and that's a challenge in itself. Luckily, there's way more resources that are free, especially I'm finding, so again, I'm based out of Calgary. So in Western Canada, there's a lot of free resources on Indigenous consultation, sensitivity, history. Those pieces have been really important. And I see them growing in other communities as well. I think we have a lot to learn though, and investing in those pieces is so important. But good question. Just taking a look. Thank you for everybody who's stepping away. Elsa, thanks for joining from Portugal. And I know we've got a few people from Colombia as well. It was great to see some of our international colleagues showing up. So these slides are always available. Thank you for joining us. And we'll talk soon. And we have more workshops coming up in the future. So feel free to always register. Great to see you all, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.